All right, so we made it to Unit 4, and we are going to be focusing on learning now. And if I'm being honest, this is the part of psychology that I find to be really exciting and really interesting. And my guess is the reason that many of you have taken the AP Psychology class. Today, this video really focuses on Module 26 on classical conditioning. So let's talk about learning for a second, okay? Because I think in order to start this unit, you're gonna have to throw out what you think learning is. Most of us think of learning, it's like watching this video, learning material, being able to articulate that material or pass a test on it, okay? And that is learning, but that's not the kind of learning that we're gonna be focusing on in these first couple of modules. In these first couple of modules, we're going to be focusing on classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning actually has nothing to do with conscientiously learning something. It's sort of what happens to us over time based on how we learn to exist in our environments, okay? So textbook definition of learning is the process of acquiring, through experience, new and relatively enduring information or behaviors, okay? Enduring meaning that it stays with us for a long period of time. So it's not just cramming for a test, passing it, dumping it all, and repeating. In the beginning of this module, you'll see a word, one of our vocab words is habituation. And I'm purposely wanting to kind of call this word out because it's an important word for learning. And it is the decreased responsiveness with a repeated exposure to a stimulus. Don't think you have to fully understand that right now, but I want to point it out because sometimes the AP test, in order to kind of make sure you really know what's what on that test, will want you to be able to demonstrate that you understand the difference between different vocab words, okay? And so two words that often get conflated for students are habituation and sensory adaptation. Sensory adaptation is from the sensation and perception unit, where our senses sort of adapt over time to our environment. Like you walk into a room or walk next to a person or stay next to a person with a ton of perfume on, you smell it really intensely at first, and then your senses sort of adapt and you smell it less intensely. Habituation is like that, but for learning. So if you're talking about learning, the term is habituation. If you're talking about something as it relates to the senses, it's sensory adaptation. So I would encourage you guys to make a note in your notes as you're taking notes. I said notes way too many times there, to make sure you put a little asterisk to differentiate those two words. How do we learn? Two types, two ways that we learn. The first way is probably the way that most of us think about. That's cognitive learning, and that's the acquisition of mental information. Okay, we're going to get there down the road in this unit. The second type of learning is associative learning, and this is really at the heart of classical conditioning. And it's learning consciously or unconsciously that certain events occur together, okay? We all respond to different stimuli in the environment, and they provoke a response from us, okay? Respondent behavior happens automatically. So this picture with the cat and the lightning kind of might be just a very simple example of that. The cat sees the lightning. She knows that the thunder is going to follow, and so she automatically cowers, okay? Versus operant behavior, it's learning that certain behaviors have a consequence. So it's that kid that learns to say please to get what they want, okay? And that's more related to operant conditioning, which you don't need to know right now. For now, let's just focus on classical conditioning. So we can't talk about classical conditioning without talking about Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, I believe, and he's the father of behaviorism. Hopefully you remember from Unit 1 with the different schools of thought in psychology that the behaviorist perspective studies behavior as a science, okay? They focus less on the mental process, meaning these are not people that are going to hook you up to an EEG and study your brainwaves. They're going to be looking at your reaction, your behavior in the environment. And so Ivan Pavlov worked with dogs primarily, and he looked at this term he coined classical conditioning. And that's a type of learning where we link two or more stimuli. Okay, I'm going to try to go through this. I think it might be confusing at first, but I think you're going to get it. So here's how classical conditioning works. Before conditioning, really there's nothing significant. In Pavlov's case, he took a neutral stimulus. In his experiment, it was a bell, okay? And he rang the bell in front of the dog. And the dog basically had no response because the dog had no connection to the bell or reason to believe that it was anything good or bad. During the process of conditioning, Pavlov would ring a bell and he would bring a bowl of food in front of the dog, okay? And the dog would start to salivate. He would start to drool because he's excited to eat this food, okay? Sometimes conditioning takes a long time and sometimes it happens very quickly. In this case, over time, every time that dog ate, Pavlov would ring the bell, present the food in front of the dog, and the dog would start to drool. And over time, what he noticed is that the dog associated the ringing of the bell with the food. And so over time, after conditioning happened, all Pavlov had to do was ring that bell and the dog was going to start to drool because the dog anticipated the food coming in front of him. Okay, so just to kind of share with you this version, before conditioning, obviously food would make a dog salivate. That's the unconditioned stimulus. It's just there. The neutral stimulus is the bell. It's neither good nor bad or indicative of anything happening. And before conditioning, that dog has no reaction to the bell, no conditioned response, okay? During conditioning, Pavlov rings the bell, he presents the food, the dog starts to salivate. This obviously has to happen multiple times. If you've ever trained a puppy, you know that this would have to happen multiple times for the dog to begin to learn. After conditioning, all Pavlov had to do was ring that bell, and that dog's response was going to be conditioned to start drooling because he's anticipating the food. So you might say, okay, that's all well and good. That's a dog. How does it apply to humans? So here's a couple of examples. They're not perfect, but I want you guys to think of your own. You're going to produce your own sort of ideas on how you see classical conditioning happening with humans. So let's talk about the school bell, right? When you're a child, the school bell rings. Okay, you're in kindergarten or first grade. That maybe doesn't necessarily mean something to you. But over time, the bell rings. Your teacher excuses you, and then you go ahead and leave the classroom, to the point where now in most high schools, 2 minutes before that bell rings, students anticipate it. The teacher says nothing, they just know to go. And if you're at school and you hear that bell, it's a trigger for you. Either A, I have to get to my class, or B, it's time for me to leave class. Another sort of way for me, when you think about food aversion, right? I have a strong food aversion to hummus because I got really sick one time after eating it. It probably wasn't the hummus at all, but that's what I associate with it, okay? So before I see the hummus, no response. I see the hummus, I get super sick. My conditioned response becomes to avoid the hummus over time. So sometimes it happens really fast, sometimes it happens really slow. This also happens with children with their parents, right? We associate certain kind of things happening and how our parents are going to react, okay? So let's say as a child you break a vase and you don't know how your parents are going to react, so you basically have no response. Okay, during conditioning as a child, you break something, mom, dad, whoever yells at you, and your unconditioned response is to be scared. Okay, so over time down the road as a kid, let's say you break something, mom or dad doesn't have to start to yell for you to start to get scared because you're anticipating that response happening. Okay, so that is classical conditioning in a nutshell. Another classic example of classical conditioning is by a guy named John Watson. We've actually talked about him. You should associate his name with the behaviorist. And he did this super unethical experiment that we call the Little Albert study. And what he did is he took this child, put it in a room. This child loved animals. Okay, and so what he did is he put a very cute little bunny next to little Albert. Little Albert was elated. He was so happy. He wanted to go pet the bunny. And as he went to go pet the bunny, the researcher came in and like banged pots and pans together to scare little Albert. Okay, and so little Albert, after that kept happening, every time he went to go touch the bunny, the researcher made a really loud noise or scared him. The child started to fear the bunny. Okay, so going back to here, if we can for a second. There it is, right? Bunny is the neutral stimulus, not necessarily any response, okay? This little Albert kid, he's presented with the bunny. The pots and pans start kind of banging and going off. Little Albert starts to get scared of the bunny, okay? And so at the end of this experiment, all little Albert had to do was see a bunny, and his conditioned response was fear, because he was anticipating those pots and pans or that mean researcher scaring him. So they've basically taken just a very cute little child and made him terrified of bunnies, which is obviously totally unethical, but it's another example of classical conditioning. So I'm going to have you all at some point in the next day or so come up with your own examples of classical conditioning just to be able to put it in context, okay? It's very important that you understand what the neutral stimulus is, what the unconditioned stimulus is, what the unconditioned response is, and how that will later become the conditioned response, okay? The unconditioned response for little Albert was fear because of the unconditioned stimulus. It later just becomes so ingrained in him, conditioned, because he attaches that neutral stimulus with the bad thing happening. All right, so acquisition and higher order conditioning, these are just kind of other terms that are important to know in terms of learning. So acquisition is the beginning phases of learning, okay? In classical conditioning, it's that as that person starts to link the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So in Pavlov's dog situation, it was pairing the bell with the salivating, okay? And little Albert, it was pairing the sight of the bunny with being scared. In operant conditioning, it's strengthening the reinforced response. Don't worry about that right now because we will get to operant conditioning next. Higher order conditioning would happen over time when the pairing of one conditioned response is paired with a new neutral stimulus. So in the case of Pavlov, rather than using a bell, he would use something else to create the same salivating response. Okay, extinction and spontaneous recovery. Extinction happens if over time the conditioned response is not compared with the neutral stimulus. We sort of kind of like lose that reaction over time. So if over time Pavlov keeps ringing the bell and no food comes, over time that dog is going to stop salivating. That's called an extinction. There's also something called spontaneous recovery, and that's the reappearance after a pause of an extinguished conditioned response. So let's say Pavlov's dog, 6 years later, he's adopted to a good home, and he hears a bell, okay? Even though that experiment is long over, sometimes there's something called spontaneous recovery. That dog will trigger somewhere in his brain and start to salivate, even though the sort of connection became extinct over time. There's also generalization and discrimination. So generalization is the tendency, once conditioned, for stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus to elicit similar responses. So in the case of little Albert, he was conditioned to fear this white little bunny. And over time, he did not just fear that white little bunny, he feared anything that was soft and white because he associated it as being similar to the bunny, and so he learned to avoid all things similar to that cute white little rabbit, whether that was like a little white mink coat, or that was actually a rat, or a nice little white kitty. He was scared of anything that was fluffy and white. He generalized that fear to other things that he wasn't initially conditioned to fear. Okay, and then discrimination would be the ability to discern between the conditioned stimulus and similar stimuli. Okay, so that would be if little Albert was only scared of the white little bunny, but was fine with the white rat and the white little kitty. So sometimes we generalize our fears or our responses, and sometimes we're able to highly discriminate that. So also, for instance, in the case of the school bell, we can discriminate between some other type of tone with our actual school bell that releases us from school. So sometimes we generalize, sometimes we have the ability to discriminate against those two things. Okay, so the biggest takeaway here is understanding classical conditioning. Classical conditioning happens when a neutral stimulus ends up pairing us with a conditioned response. And that happens during conditioning. This process can be very fast in the term, like in the example of my aversion to hummus with food poisoning, or it might take a long time to pair, like the dog and the bell with the unconditioned response of the salivating. So in classical conditioning, the unconditioned response, the drooling, actually becomes the conditioned response when it's paired strictly with the neutral stimulus. Okay, I get that this is kind of a heavy lift, but I think you can do it. In a little bit, I'm going to have you guys come up with your own examples of classical conditioning. All right, thanks so much.